The End of the Cold War and Its Lasting Impact, Unit 12. First of all, let's review some of the basic ideas behind the Cold War. The Cold War was fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers who had nuclear weapons immediately following World War II. It was a contest of capitalism or democracy versus communism. But that doesn't mean that not being a communist made you a good guy. And the U.S. winds up supporting some very difficult leaders in some of these countries just because those leaders are not communists. Containment was the determining policy for the U.S., and it focused on stopping the spread of communism and achieving that goal through military, political, and financial support. Cold War hotspots that we've already talked about. In Europe, we've discussed the division between NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. And we've also talked about Berlin, and you can see the Berlin Wall pictured below. In Asia, we've talked about three specific locations. In China, where Mao Zedong led communist forces to victory over nationalists in 1949. In Korea, where the United States helped the nationalists fight to a draw, and Korea remains divided today, north as communist, south as free. And in Vietnam, where the U.S. also helped support nationalist forces in the south until those forces were defeated and Vietnam was united under a communist government. In addition, there are some other places that we haven't talked as much about. In Latin America, the United States supported an overthrow of the elected government because the government was friendly to communists and to the Soviets. In Cuba, the United States attempted to overthrow the communist leader Fidel Castro and wound up blockading Cuba to prevent the installation of missiles there in 1962, and again in Nicaragua, where the U.S. backed a nationalist government against an elected government that was communist. In the Middle East, the United States supported a nationalist dictator in Iran until he was overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini, pictured in the middle, in 1979. And in Afghanistan, long before the United States was ever at war in Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan as a show of their power in the early 1980s. Let's talk about how the Cold War ended. First of all, you need to know that even though both of these large nations were communists, that the Soviets and the Chinese split. They had different worldviews on how to spread communism and how to extend their influence, especially in places in Africa and Asia. The 1970s saw the thawing of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union for a time. This was called détente, or lessening of Cold War tensions, which was led by President Richard Nixon. You can see him here descending Air Force One for the first visit by an American president to communist China in the early 70s. Nixon also opened negotiations with the Soviets to help to reduce nuclear weapons. These were called the SALT negotiations. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. However, by the 1980s, the Cold War had intensified again when the man on the left in this picture, President Ronald Reagan, was elected. He used tough anti-communist rhetoric and increased military spending by the United States. He was especially in favor of the United States developing a missile shield that would prevent incoming nuclear missiles from hitting the United States. At the same time, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, and he initiated two programs that are going to eventually lead to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first was called Glasnost, which was openness in order to promote social and economic reforms. And for the first time in a long time, Soviet citizens had more individual freedom than they had ever experienced. The second policy was perestroika, or economic restructuring to make production more efficient. And this moved the Soviet Union away from the state or the government controlling all of the economic decisions that were made in the nation. Eventually, Gorbachev is going to be pushed from power and the Soviet Union is going to collapse and disband. Boris Yeltsin, pictured here at the right, becomes Russia's first directly elected president. Now, this involves a lot of transition issues in the Soviet Union. The economy actually got worse when it went away from state control for a time because of inflation and corruption and competition. And there's also been some political crises as leaders have tried to establish their power and authority in this sort of new post-communist world. In addition to that, many of the former Soviet republics like Lithuania and Georgia, and even in today's news, Ukraine, broke away from Russian control and tried to establish their own nations that were independent and in some cases democratic. In terms of Eastern Europe, you know that the Berlin Wall came down late in 1989, and that shortly thereafter Germany was reunified, and we have a unified Germany today. There are also a number of nationalist movements and border changes in Europe. Czechoslovakia split into two countries, which are today the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, or Slovakia. Yugoslavia, which was a country that had been put together and comprised of a number of different ethnic groups, fell apart. And at the right here you see the city of Sarajevo, and it was characterized by intense fighting in the 1990s and early 2000s. What is the lasting impact of the Cold War? In a number of categories you can see this. First of all, despite the fact that the Cold War was not always about open, direct conflict, there were a number of people killed as a result of the Cold War, both soldiers and civilians, in some of these places that we've discussed. The world continues to deal with this idea of nuclear proliferation and the weapons stockpiles that were created during the Cold War, as well as ongoing political tensions. Just because the Soviet Union no longer exists and Russia doesn't operate with a communist-style government doesn't mean that Russia and the rest of the world see eye to eye on everything. And there is tremendous economic cost in building up the weapons stockpiles and promoting the Cold War ideals. So while the Cold War may have officially ended, its impact is still felt in a number of different ways. This is the end of the video on the Cold War. If you need to rewind or rewatch any part of it, please feel free to do so. Thanks for listening.